Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about the Norse in Age of Mythology Retold. The Norse are in a bit of a peculiar spot as a civilization. They don't have the economic advantages of, say, the Egyptians, nor are they as well-rounded as either the Greeks and to a lesser extent as the Atlanteans. Rather, they're focusing on specific benefits for certain units. Though they are heavily focused with their units on melee, their range is nowhere near as good as some of the other civilizations. So let's consider the pros and cons of playing the Norse in the game. So one particular benefit is that they have gatherers and dwarves. Gatherers cost food, as they do for other civilizations, whereas dwarves just cost gold. Now, it might seem expensive to have to spend gold for a gatherer specialized on getting it, but here's the thing. In the early game, one of the limiting factors for your economy is not necessarily going to be gold. It's going to be food. You need 400 food to get to H2. A lot of units early on do require more food than gold. And of course, a lot of your gatherers do require food. So having a unit dedicated on getting you gold is actually overall a benefit. Though keep in mind, dwarves are 20% faster at gathering gold, but they're 20% slower on food and wood, unless you're playing 4, and even then with 4, your dwarves are not as good as gatherers when it comes to food in particular. One of the upsides, but also the downsides for the Norse is that their storehouses come in the form of ox carts, so they don't need the structure for it as the Greeks or Egyptians, though the Atlanteans don't need any kind of thing for dropping off resources, but you do have a mobile drop site. The benefit of this is, of course, you don't have to constantly rebuild granaries, storehouses, etc., and you can just select one of these ox carts and assign them to either wood or food or gold, and they'll move closer, as you're chopping down, as you're dealing with food. You can just move it closer or shift click an action so that once one tree is down, the ox cart is going to move closer to another tree and all that kind of stuff. So that is a particular benefit for the ox carts. The downside is that they cost food in order to make. So early on, very early on, the fact that you have to spend that resource can be a bit of an issue, but you more than make up for it in a longer term. So both a pro and a con for the Norse in that particular respect. Another thing to mention about the Norse is that their gathering units do not construct buildings, except farms and, well, houses and ox carts. Rather, the vast majority of buildings are constructed by your military units. This overall is a pretty substantial benefit because it means you don't have to reassign one of your workers or a couple of your workers to construct buildings, especially later on in the game. Like if you're looking to construct, a Titan Gate or a Wonder, it saves you so much not having to assign your gatherers to construct those kind of buildings or hill forts or anything. Like any kind of military production, any town center, you can keep your workers safe. So if you're trying to do, an aggressive push, or you're trying to take town centers, or you're trying to build towers closer to the enemy base, you do have that kind of benefit with the Norse because your military units are constructing those buildings. So that is a fairly substantial benefit from my perspective with the Norse. Now, another thing to mention is that they have really solid melee infantry and cavalry as well. Between your herdmans, which are anti-cav units, your berserkers that are good against everything, your throwing axemen that are good against infantry. So the thing about throwing axemen is that unlike most archer units, they're doing hack damage as opposed to piercing damage. They may not have the range of other range units in the game, but it is still an advantage with respect to them as an infantry unit. Then you have Huskarls focused against ranged soldiers that cost wood. So pros in that respect. In terms of cavalry, you do have Jarls. Now, Jarls have been changed from a cavalry unit dedicated against myth units to being good against everything. Though you can still get some benefits to make them, in particular with Njord, to get them ring figure that makes them better against myth units. Though crucially not great against myth unit special attacks. But you do have raiding cavalry, you do have Jarls, so you do have those kind of options available to you. One of the biggest downsides, however, for them from a military perspective with their human soldiers is the fact that they don't have any kind of ranged, fast-moving unit, which every other civilization has, one way or another. Even if with the Greeks you have to go for the Centaur, and you have to go for Hermes, who can be lacking in other respects, the fact that the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Atlanteans do have a fast-moving or a flying unit, ranged unit, is useful. Yes, the Atlantean Therma is not particularly great, but at least it is available. And don't even get me started with the discussion about the Stymphalian bird, which you can get for the Atlantean. So those kind of benefits are pretty substantial because they give you a lot more flexibility, map control, just speed around the battlefield to control said battlefield against your enemy. So that is a particular downside that the Norse do have. But I would say the single biggest downside that the Norse do have is with regards to how they gain favor. I think, overall, it would probably be safe to say that the Norse do gain favor in the least reliable way, and crucially, the slowest way. Now, it isn't necessarily the case in every game, depends on what you're dealing with and what units you're getting. But generally speaking, you'll gain favor by fighting in battle. Problem with that is, unlike the Egyptians who have a constant favor trickle through their monuments, or the Greeks who can assign a lot of workers for favor, or the Atlanteans who can just get oracles to generate favor faster, you may end up in a favor deficit, which means less god powers, which means less myth units. You do have some really powerful but expensive myth units in things like, say, the mountain giants, Fafnirs, fire giants, etc., but you may be lacking in favor compared to the other civilizations to compete with them. And this is actually a pretty substantial issue, I would say, not necessarily in the early game, but more so in a long game. So for team games, for longer games that you might play in 1v1, that can be a substantial issue that you are dealing with. The power is there, but it just kind of feels out of reach given that particular situation. Another downside, if you will, with the Norse is how their siege works. They have melee siege. They have portable ramps. Now, here's the problem with this. When you having a ranged siege unit, which even the Atlanteans, yes, they have destroyers at tier 3, but they have fire siphons at tier 4. Having only a good melee siege unit is a downside. Ballistas are not really good against buildings. They're decent, as the tooltip suggests, but they're not really great. They're more useful against units as opposed to buildings. So you're really lacking in terms of a ranged siege option. Unless we are counting, Fafnirs and fire giants, but then you run into the problem of, you need favor for these guys, and that can be an issue. Like, if you're playing a very long game and you're constantly engaging in fights, it might not necessarily be the same problem, but is an issue. Another problem I would dare say with the Norse is their weakness in some ways in terms of dealing with myth units. This might sound surprising. I mean, you have Godis, you have Hersiers, right? So you should have a good amount of capability against myth units. But the problem is, one, those units are not necessarily cheap. Like, you look at a Hersier, 80 food, 40 gold. Or you're looking at a Godi, you're looking at 80 wood, 40 gold, and their combat ability against human soldiers is not going to be fantastic. They're anti-myth units. They're not particularly great and necessarily great, or at least in terms of trading against other units, they're not particularly great in that respect. And they're not so durable that you can get away with just a couple of them against really powerful myth units. So this is a problem. Like, you can talk about, like, say, the Egyptians relying on being reliant on priests, but the Egyptians do have that pharaoh, and priests are long range. When you compare it to a Godi, say for instance, a priest may be a lot more vulnerable than a Godi, for instance, but it's longer range. It can heal as well. And yes, you don't have the inherent ability of picking up relics with the priest, but the defensive benefit that priests have from their range is not something to ignore compared to, say, the Godi or the Herseer, who have to get up close and personal. And it's really the Herseers that you want because they have that kind of benefit in terms of favor generation. But you are going to suffer in other ways if you go with a lot of Herseers. So that is a particular problem from my perspective with them. It is something that does hurt them quite a bit. Another thing to also mention is that Norse defenses, while Norse may excel at aggressiveness on the battlefield, and that's kind of the thing, like the way they generate favor, the way their resource ox carts keep moving, and you want to keep moving, from patch to patch. They're not necessarily so great at defenses. I mean, in general, we could talk about the lack of defenses, how defenses easily crumble in this game, fair enough. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but in terms of defenses, Norse do have the worst defenses in the game because they don't have walls that are as good as anyone else. They don't have towers that are as good as anyone else. You may have the ability of building more towers faster because your military units can construct them. You may have that particular ability, and you can transform your gathering units into berserkers, or using Ragnarok for, an ability that may end the game right there and then if you time it correctly, though it can also bite you in the ass in that respect. So those are some of the advantages and disadvantages. They excel at aggressiveness. You want to keep fighting. You benefit from fighting in terms of favor. That is a particular benefit, and that mobility that you get from your military units being able to construct buildings or being used to construct buildings, that is a benefit, but you're weak on the defense, and you don't have the same kind of roster options that some of the other races do. Because you look at, the Greeks, they have great infantry, they have great ranged units, and if you choose to go with Hermes as either Zeus or Poseidon, you have that ranged harass unit. It's not useful in every situation, but just having that kind of option is an important factor. Like same with Termas or Chariot Archers, like really great units, all of those, like Chariot Archers in particular, because they're always available for Egyptians, whereas, for the Greeks you have to choose to go Hermes, and Hades doesn't have that. Oh, mind you, he has other advantages, significant and ones that shouldn't be ignored. So those are some of the problems and some of the and also some of the benefits for the Norse. It's also kind of worth pointing out that they do have some really powerful god power. So if your enemy is building defenses, well, you can always use Undermine with Heimdall if you do have him as either Loki or Odin. You can get trolls that are really strong in terms of their AoE damage capability, though not so great in terms of their survivability aspect. Or we can build forward defenses with our Guardian Bastions, but for every benefit there is a weakness. There's a lot of trade-offs you get with the Norse that, say the Greeks don't necessarily have. Like, I don't know what the multiplayer statistics are right now, like which civilizations are dominant at the moment, but one of the things I think is fair to say is that the dominant civilization overall is likely not the Norse at the moment. Though, uncertain, right? I don't have those statistics. I've looked like we do. I would like to see those statistics. I've seen some sites that are trying to compile them, but right now it's a bit unclear. But yeah, some benefits and some weaknesses as well to go with the Norse. It is kind of worth saying, though, that when you look at Thor, when you look at Loki, they are, or even Freyr, they are lacking quite a few ways. One of the benefits of Odin is that he does go a long way towards helping with some of the early game issues you may have as the Norse. Great Hunt is that big of a deal. Or Great Whole units generating 25% extra favor in battle is a fairly substantial benefit. Or even Loki, like the fact that he reduces the ox cart cost by 50% is not something to ignore. Or the fact that his gatherers and dwarves can be turned into berserkers for free. Don't ignore that benefit because it is substantial enough. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more.